Good afternoon. I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes to get in, and then we will begin our program this afternoon. But welcome to all of you who have joined here. I'll introduce myself and get us started in just a moment. All right, well, let's begin. I'm John Piotti, and I want to welcome you here today. It's wonderful to be engaging with kindred spirits who care about farming and care about food and care about our future. I'm John Piotti. I'm the president and CEO of American Farmland Trust. Have been for about 4 years, and I'm connecting to you from my home in the great state of Maine, where I'm here by myself and today, and that means I have no technical support on site. But fortunately, a great member of AFT staff, Alex, is there out in the virtual world to help support these efforts. We've all been learning how to do things virtually over the last few months, but I have never used one of these Facebook forums before. So fingers crossed, bear with me, and hopefully it will all go well. This is the first of two virtual events. And today's focus is really on some of the challenges that are facing agriculture. And then on Tuesday, we're going to talk about some of the remedies, some of the solutions, and some of the programs that are happening or being proposed that can help confront some of those challenges. There is a chat function here today in the Facebook forum, and I'm going to attempt to follow that. So if you do have any questions or comments during the course of the presentation and event, feel free to jot them down. And if there's time and it relates to what we're talking to and I can figure out how to read it, we'll raise that issue as well. So that's the plan for today. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to acknowledge the moment. The world is a different place than it was at the beginning of this year. The pandemic has impacted all of us, sometimes quite profoundly, sometimes quite tragically. At the same time, in the last few months, there's been a real appreciation, public awareness has been growing around issues of social and racial injustice that really alert us to how we are not where we want or need to be as a society. And I wanted to flag those two things up front because they are interconnected with agriculture. The pandemic really raised in many people's minds the concerns and issues around food supply, issues of food security and community resilience, and the like. And some of these issues of racial injustice and inequality, well, agriculture has, through its history and in the course of its future, is directly engaged in some of these issues of diversity and inclusion and justice. They have been part of agriculture's history, both good and bad, and need to be a big part of our course going forward. So I wanted to acknowledge that in the future, and I suspect that those themes will come up during the course of both today and Tuesday. But I'm going to begin now by talking about farming and beginning really with a few fundamentals. So we all know that farming is a source of a lot of our food, but we sometimes don't think about everything else that farming is. It is the core of many of our rural communities. It brings a lot of vibrancy to those communities. It is critical for all sorts of forms of outdoor recreation, be it hunting or up here in Maine, snowmobiling and things like that. We use farmland for those kind of purposes. It's scenery. It's a great feeling to go out on the countryside and see open farmland. It's sort of connecting back to our roots in the Garden of Eden, you might say. Beyond all that, farming provides some really critical environmental benefits, environmental services, you might even say. That might include water recharge. It includes wildlife habitat. It includes pollinator habitat, and also, and increasingly, we're thinking about how farming can be a way of taking atmospheric carbon and sequestering it in the soil. Through practices that build soil health, we take carbon and draw it down into our soil, where it then does wonderful things. And so farming is not only far more than food, but it also has a really big role to play in helping heal and restore our planet. If you've ever seen any of the public presentations I make, which often talk about farming and lace in a lot of information about climate change, I'll sometimes say the world changed on October 6, 2018. And that's the date that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a big report that said, as fundamental as it is, as critically important as it is for us to reduce emissions from fossil fuels, that alone, we have to do it, but that alone will never be enough to get us to the goals of the 2015 Paris Accords. To get there, we also have to pursue so-called natural solutions, which are ways that the earth itself, given the chance, can re-heal itself. And farming, through better farming practices, is one of those natural solutions. We can take that carbon and we can take it from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil. So farming is about more than food. It's about all these critical other things, including a way of combating climate change, the issue of our times. And so at AFT, we talk about farming as being really about the future, and that the future of farming thus is our future, right? Farming is not about the 1% of Americans who do the work. It's about the 100% of all of us who eat food and live on this planet. The final point that I want to make is that that future of where farming goes from now, that is really about what happens in the next few years. And I don't mean to be melodramatic here. This is something that I think universally scientists, academics, and policymakers are realizing, that farming has a big role to play, and we have to take steps in the near term. So the future hinges really on what we do next. So that's a little bit about, just to put this in context. The other piece of context that I need to talk about is American Farmland Trust. And just so you understand what our role has been and how we connect with these issues. So American Farmland Trust just 2 weeks ago celebrated our 40th birthday. We were created in 1980, and we were created to fill a huge void. At that time, back 40 years ago, there was no organization that really focused on the middle ground between agricultural issues and environmental issues. Those two worlds were at loggerheads. They still are in some ways, but not as they were 40 years ago. And in fact, many agricultural organizations now embrace environmentally forward practices, and many environmental organizations no longer see farmers as an enemy, but as a potential partner, or as a real partner doing good work on the ground. They view farmers as being stewards of that land. That is a sea change. That is a huge change in mindset that didn't exist 40 years ago. And it's one of the testaments to what AFT has done. We've made it safe and possible for a whole host of other organizations to now recognize that agriculture and the environment are two sides of the same coin. So we really launched this movement that sometimes is referred to as conservation agriculture. And I just want to highlight some of the things that have happened in the last 40 years. First off, we've protected millions of acres of land. Now, when I say protected, there's really two forms. There's permanent land protection that occurs, and usually the vehicle for doing that is a legal instrument called an agricultural conservation easement. And easements have been used to permanently protect land, which means in their deed, they can never be subdivided, they can never be turned into house lots and the like. That land will always be available for farming. In the last 40 years, over 6.5 million acres of farmland has been permanently protected in that way, a real accomplishment. But that's not the only form of protection. Protection also comes in the form of land that has not been developed because of other steps we have taken. Maybe it's been tax policy that gives farmers a break by valuing that property at its current use as farmland rather than at its highest development potential. Maybe it's been good community planning, good zoning, agricultural districts, one of a number of tools that help make sure that that land stays in farming rather than goes to sprawl. So millions of acres, that kind of protection totals over 300 million acres. So taken together, this is significant. It's not to mean that there aren't problems and challenges. We're going to hear about those in a minute, but it's a real accomplishment what has happened in 40 years. That's the land. Let's move on to farming practices. Huge strides have been made in the last 40 years to advance farming practices. And the principal vehicle for that has been the Farm Bill. The conservation title of the Farm Bill, which AFT was the principal architect of and champion for, was enacted in 1985. And since then, it has gone on and provided, at this point, over $115 billion for farmers to improve their farming practices. And it has made a huge difference on the landscape. Again, not enough. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I would hate to think where we would be right now if the conservation title had never been created and we didn't have these 35 years to sort of get ready for the next wave of activity that's needed. The third thing that AFT has done is had a real impact on farmers and ranchers, on the people who actually steward our land and do the hard work, the incredible hard work day in and day out to keep food on our table and keep these environmental services supporting our society. We estimate that we've helped one way or another over 500,000, 500,000 farm families in that period of time. So it's a body of real accomplishment. And yet, at the same time, there are still challenges, considerable challenges. And we are going to talk about those tonight. So I'm going to bring in three guests, all AFT staffers with considerable expertise. And I'm going to bring those three guests in turn, discuss some of the challenges. And I'm going to begin tonight with Mitch Hunter, who's our research director. And there he is.
Hi, John.
Mitch. How are you tonight?
Pretty good. Yeah,
great.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges facing the land, and then I'm going to open it up to let Mitch respond to this, and we're going to have a little dialogue. So every day, 2,000 acres of farmland, irreplaceable farmland, are converted to some other use. That is 11 million acres over the last 15 years. Now, I think a lot of us know about urban sprawl. We see the farm on the edge of town get chopped up into house lots. That's very visible. But this is not only urban sprawl. It's also what we call low-density rural development, that 100-acre parcel being divided up over maybe 10 years into 5 and 10 or 20-acre lots that become unsuitable, unviable for farming. And as a result of the impact being both rural and urban, every state is impacted. This is not a phenomenon that only occurs on the coast or only occurs right around metropolitan areas. Might be worse right around a growing metropolitan area, but it is a problem that we are encountering everywhere. So, Mitch, you had the research team that keeps track of this big database that we have and has just come out with this big study we call Farming on the Edge. Those stats that I just referenced come from that study. Given your intimate knowledge of this, what do you really see as the big challenges facing our farmland, our ranch land in the coming years?
Yeah, great questions, John. I wanted to pick up on one of the threads that you kind of laid down about this low density residential land use. And it's not new in the sense that nobody knew it was happening, but it's new in the sense that no one had ever measured it before. So we were able to identify it really for the first time. And we realized that it's a really big deal. So out of those 11 million acres that you mentioned that were converted, almost 7 million of those acres were actually converted to low density residential land use. So that is a big blow to agriculture and the environment already. And then we also found that that land turns over quickly. Pieces of it, at least, can turn over quickly to even denser and more intense development. So a further threat down the road. And since it's a lot harder to see than your typical sprawl of strip malls and subdivisions, there really hasn't been much of a policy response at the state level. So that's something that we're looking at a lot and that we think is a major challenge that states and the federal government really need to pick up on and respond to, and local governments as well, which have so much power and importance in terms of land use. So that's one big thing that came out of our study. And the other thing that I think we really need to touch on is that we're not just losing a lot of land, we are also losing some of our best land, converting it to this these different types of development. And so out of the 11 million acres that were converted over those 15 years, about 4.5 million were what we call nationally significant land. So we've done the analysis across the entire lower 48. We've identified the best land in the country for producing the food that we all depend on. And 4.5 million of those acres were converted over that time period. It happened in every state. And so every state is actually threatening the actual foundation of their local and regional food systems, making it harder for farmers to access land. And also when they lose those more productive acres, the more sensitive lands take more of the pressure to produce more and more food. So that can be a threat not only to food security, but also to wildlife, to water quality, and of course to the climate. So I think those are some of the things that jump out to me as major challenges.
Yeah, and I don't want to dive too deep into some of the research geekiness here, but the two things that you mentioned, I think are worth noting that they are somewhat new on the research front, right? They're really, we had never tracked, no one had ever tracked this, rural low density development before, and knowing what the problem is and being able to identify it is a huge part of the solution, right? And you at least can call it something. And on this issue of our best land, we've always used soil and soil type as really the indicator of good quality land, and that is important. But first off, the soil maps can be pretty bad in some spots. A lot of them were done in the 30s. They're somewhat I would say irrelevant, but not as accurate. If there's been 100 years of poor land use in the intervening period. But second, soil type in itself is not everything. So you've also developed these other measures to determine our best land. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so we were, again, like you're saying, not just solely focused on the soil. I mean, I'm an agronomist, so I think the soil is incredibly important, and it is, but we were thinking bigger than that and thinking about the future, which is kind of what we do at AFT. So we were not just looking at productivity, but we were also looking at versatility and resiliency. And to get at that whole kind of set of characteristics, not just productivity, we use the soil quality. We also use the limitations to production on that soil. So can it stand up to prolonged use in cropping, or is it better suited to be used for something else, like pasture, like wildlife habitat, what have you, range grazing, that sort of thing. And also we looked at what can be grown there, because there are places where it doesn't have kind of the ideal soil, but it has a soil that's great for growing a certain type of crop. And so those areas really light up on our maps. And the one that always comes to mind for me is the Palisade Peach region in Colorado. It's very famous, very unique, just this microclimate with the right temperature and slope and soil to grow incredible peaches. And if you just looked at typical soil quality, you'd never pick that up. But we're able to bring in the information that lets us highlight those really, really important growing regions across the country, the cherry belt in Michigan or what have you, that are pretty critical to protect, because we can't just swap in an acre of any old soil to grow those same crops. So they have, to me, a much higher priority to get in there and focus our protection efforts.
Great. Well, it's a huge study. We've been at this game for a long time and had many different studies over the years, but the latest version, Farms Under Threat, just came out in May, and people should go online and look it up. It's full of great info. I'm going to set aside the land for a while, and we're going to talk about farming practices. Okay. But we'll be returning to you, Mitch, so don't go too far. And I'm going to introduce the second guest I have, who is Jimmy Daukus, who's a senior program officer at AFT. Good to see you, Jimmy.
Good to see you. Glad to be here.
Great. And Jimmy's been with AFT for an awful long time. I don't know if that's a fair way to phrase it or not, but he's done a number of things at AFT, pretty much everything in every department at different times, and he's our utility player. And one of the things he's done, he was heavily involved in a lot of our early climate work a dozen or more years ago, leading up to the Waxman-Markey bill in 2009. And when I came in at AFT, we had a goal to increase our climate work considerably. And I turned to Jimmy as that great utility player and said, let's build a new climate initiative. And so he's been working on that, and brought in a great climate director who couldn't join us today, and some other staff, and it's going great guns. And as I said earlier, farming practices are potentially a real key to combating climate change. And yet there are challenges, and here are some of the challenges. One of those practices that we talk about all the time is cover crops. And yet at this point in time, only 5% of our cropland is in cover crops. And another one of those practices we talk about all the time is something called no-till, planting and harvesting crops without disturbing the soil, without using a plow. And that is, to a layman, that might seem a little odd. Isn't farming about plowing and about tilling the soil? But what it does, when you don't disturb the soil, you don't break up its structure, you don't release the carbon that's in the soil back into the atmosphere. So two practices that we know that work, but are not being used at the level needed. And meanwhile, some of the problems of poor practices continue. There continues to be nitrogen runoff and phosphorus runoff. It's contributing to poor water quality, to dead zones and water bodies. And farming, although it could be part of the solution to climate change, right now is emitting 9% of all U.S. carbon emissions. So with that background and information, Jimmy, we know what needs to happen. AFT has been in this game for close to 40 years. Others have been doing it not as long, but in some cases more intensely than us recently. Yet we haven't yet moved the needle. What are the challenges that are before us?
Thank you, John. Well, I agree that we're simply not realizing the promise of farms, restoring the planet. And as you said, there are conservation practices on millions of acres, but we need more, much more, and we need it now. I wouldn't say that we haven't moved the needle. I think we've moved the needle. If you look at it and you see where we were, well, back in the 30s, it was devastating. But even in the last 10 and 20 years, so we've learned a lot, and those numbers are all higher than they used to be. But farmers and ranchers and landowners face, real barriers to adoption. They include the cost to implement these things, risk, lack of equipment and technical assistance, just knowledge, and just learning new ways of doing things. And the way I like to think about some of these serious challenges is, what do you do about them? And the challenges are improving the programs, the conservation programs that we have. Increasing incentives so that there's more financial incentives for the farmers and ranchers, expanding our technical assistance to implement it on the ground, peer-to-peer outreach and training that would help to make this happen and get people to understand how and where they can get resources. And then lastly, just more research to understand or to better understand, I should say, and to quantify the impacts of these conservation practices. So we know a lot about them, but we don't always have the tools to measure them. So as you said, we know that it can be done, and we know this in part just some states are well above or have multiple times above the national average in those cover crops and tillage numbers. So we know that it can be done, and states have been doing it. So AFT and its partners are working with farmers and ranchers to try to make that happen.
Great. Now, one of the things you mentioned, Jimmy, was sort of the cost of doing all of this. And some people might say, well, why do we have to pay farmers for doing this? Shouldn't they just do it? But the truth is that we pay farmers for the food they grow, but we don't, in an organized fashion, not through a market in any form as yet, at least, pay farmers for all of this myriad of environmental services they provide. And incentives and support through something like the conservation title is one way, a small way, but one way that we can help farmers who want to do. I mean, my experience, I've worked with farmers professionally for 30 years, and my experience is I've never met a farmer who doesn't want to do what's right by the land, but they also need to keep the farm, so they have to stay in business. And so incentives like this are critical to have them take on some of these forward-looking practices. Can you speak to that and what some of the challenges are there for farmers?
Well, I think farmers and ranchers and landowners, often people will say what you said, which is, oh, well, in the long run, shouldn't they be doing it? Or isn't this good for them in the long run? And without realizing that there are short-term costs and risks. So farmers and ranchers are looking at each year having a crop and having their economic viability rely on that year-by-year investment, and them taking on, and it's a low margin industry, and for them to take on additional costs, whether it's for cover crop seed or it might be a new piece of equipment, and also the potential for a risk where, especially in the short term, there is a risk of, a learning curve in new practice, but also a risk of just a yield impact while you're learning how to do these things. So we're very clear that over the long run, it's good for. We're building soil health, which helps productivity, which helps resiliency. But in the short term, farmers are faced with these practices, faced with increased costs for these practices and trying to make decisions. Now, markets are an idea of paying for some of the ecosystem services that they're offering. So that's another way of thinking about getting money. And most farmers that we talk to, as long as they can get some money, if they get it as cost share or if they got it as payment for that ecosystem service and acknowledgement of that sequestration, that would be fine. But we also have that kind of question of how do we deal with the first couple of years? One of the people out in the field that we worked with always said, the farmers who have experience with cover crops and tillage might leave after the first or second year. All the people who stick with it for 4 or 5 years, they never go back. So there's a question of how do we help deal with the risk and share the cost, right? As you said, these are public benefits. How do we share that with those farmers so that we can get to that long-term gain?
Great. We're going to come back to you in a bit, Jimmy. I want to get Julia in here and talk about the third leg of the stool. Talk about the farmers and ranchers themselves. Julia, you with us?
I am. Hi.
Hey there. How are you? Good.
Good. It's great to be here. It's great that everybody's here. And John,
it's kind of fun to do this.
This is my first one too. So.
So anyway, Julia has been with AFT for over 30 years and is really a recognized expert in food systems and ag viability and support for new and beginning farmers and planning for agriculture and a whole host of issues. So I could think of absolutely no one better to help us talk about how the farmers and ranchers fit into this. And, you know, we all know that farming is an incredibly hard business for everyone. Farmers are struggling. They're always struggling or seem to always be struggling. And last year, actually, there were a lot of heartbreaking stories from the farm community based on floods, based on the price of milk, on a whole host of things. That was before the pandemic. And with the disruptions that have occurred in the last 5-6 months, things for a lot of farmers have gotten considerably worse. So as we think about farmers and ranchers, it's as Jimmy just said, it's a low margin business with a lot of risks, and yet it's struggling. There's also a demographic issue here. 40% of the owners of farmland right now are folks who are age 65 or older. And that means there's some kind of pretty large transition that's going to happen in the not too distant future. The flip side of that is there are a lot of people who want to farm. A lot of people who are eager and willing, and you know, sometimes I hear, yeah, but they say that, but they don't want to work hard. I've spent much of my career working with new and beginning farmers. Many of them are now in their 60s because I started this 30 years ago. But believe me, they understand the work that's involved. They want to do it, but the barriers to entry are huge. Again, low margin business, but with high costs of entry. Land is expensive, equipment is expensive. So Julia, when you put all these issues together, and when you recognize that we can talk about saving farmland, we can talk about good practices, but if we don't have the hardworking folks who are going to do it, it's irrelevant. What are our challenges here and how, well, I guess on Tuesday we talked about how we overcome the challenges. Right now, we just want to hear about what are the challenges.
So you outlined them very well. I think they're all interconnected, the sort of economics and the demographics and I think historic patterns of land ownership and all of that. I also think that, as you mentioned, the pandemic has really shone a light on what I consider the fragility of our food and farming systems. And a lot of that has come because we've become so consolidated, maybe overly consolidated, in an effort to become really efficient and sort of rewarding productivity instead of maybe looking at some of those externalities that Jimmy was talking about, looking at the value to communities, to food access and health, all of those kinds of things. But that consolidation has really threatened food and ag economies so that you saw the kind of crises that we saw during the pandemic and makes it really hard to pivot. So I think for a new generation to enter, what I'm seeing in a new generation is they tend to be a lot more diverse. They often are very committed to community, to local and regional food systems, to regenerative practices. But all those trends that are affecting mid-sized farmers, small and mid-sized commercial farmers, make it even harder for a new generation to get onto the land, especially if they don't inherit it. And in the past, you know, so you're talking about that 40% of landowners who are age 65 and older, they're also 98% white. And then you have this new generation of producers coming on that's much more diverse. You know, they may be new Americans, they may be from a non-farming background, they may be veterans, they may be women. It's just a very different kind of group of people entering agriculture maybe than in the past. And so how do we make that transition happen when traditionally it's been through cradle, altar, or grave? So it passes through a family. And that's one of those challenges that I think we all really have to look at very seriously, because today most farmers acquire their land from a non-relative. And so that old system isn't really working very well. And so how do we make sure that we get that new generation on, both to have secure land tenure, but also to have access to capital and markets and opportunity?
Yeah. And let me just, you've been talking about how the dots are connected. I'm just going to connect two of them, because we do focus a lot of our work and attention on the next generation because they're critical, right? And yet we also put time and effort into trying to help existing farmers be successful. And those two things are interconnected, right? Because if someone goes out of business now, they're not going to have a farm that can be passed on. They're not going to be in a position to maybe mentor or be more generous in a transition in the future. So it's about both helping existing farmers succeed and making sure we have a new crop of farmers and ranchers to replace them. Is that, tell me where I got that right, where I got it wrong, whether there's any
No, absolutely. And that's why sort of, even when I talk about new gen, I kind of throw in the small and mid-sized commercial producers, because they're the ones who are really getting squeezed by this consolidation. And yet new farmers enter, they tend to be small and mid-sized and need to build up. And there's a real breakdown of people who really want to not just farm to sort of make a life, but farm to make a living as a profession, as a career. And you said something earlier, actually, when you were talking to Jimmy about how we pay farmers for the food they grow. And that's true.
Sometimes not enough.
Poorly for the food. We do not.
Yeah, talk to any dairy farmer would tell you, right? My comment. Yeah.
Right. Most of the food price is actually in the supply chain actors between the farmer and when you go to the supermarket. And so I think that there are structural issues that we really have to address for the future of agriculture. So we focus on a new generation because we want a future for agriculture, but we don't want to focus on them at the expense of all of the other people who are struggling to make it and really survive. And, and again, not all new producers are young. The average age of a beginning farmer is 46. So so we have to look at young, because I think it's especially difficult for the young because of credit and finance and money. And then we also have to look at more people who are sort of middle-aged and mid-career and either coming back to a farm family because they really miss it, or because they're at a point in their life where they want to enter and have a different kind of life. And I think there's a huge future there. We just have to sort of dismantle the barriers to make it more possible for more people.
That's great. So I can't help but comment on the background behind you. I think the rest of us are in our homes, and I think for you, for reasons of internet, went into the Northampton office. Or is that,
I did.
Is that correct? Yeah. So
yes, because I live in a little rural community.
No farm, no food banner. That's great. I like it. It's good. It's good stuff. I want to bring Mitch and Jimmy back in here, and we're going to engage in a sort of a broader conversation, and then there might be a couple of questions. A few people have made comments or questions. I'm going to try to get to a few of those. But we've been talking about the land and how that's critical. If we don't have the land, we can't do any of this. We've been talking about the importance of farming practices and the challenge that we're not adopting the best practices fast enough. So one challenge, we're losing the land. Another is we're not adopting practices fast enough. And then when we talk about the people, we worry if there's going to be farmers and ranchers who can afford to stay in business and afford to bring on their replacements, the new crop, the next generation, if you will, of farmers and ranchers. That's a pretty big bundle. And yet, as you all know, I often talk about AFT as having this sort of holistic approach to issues in agriculture, which is somewhat unusual. Actually, it's rare. We're the only national organization that really does take this approach, being about the land and the practices and the people who do the work. But I'm going to push it even further, because at its best, those things have an interplay. It's not just we have to think about each of those three things. They actually they're connected. I have my own thoughts and ideas on how they're interconnected, but I want to hear from each of you in turn. I'm going to start with you, Julie, and we'll go backwards at this point. But tell me how issues of the people, the farmers and ranchers themselves, do or do not connect into issues about land, issues about practices and how that either complicates the challenge or maybe gives us even some new opportunities to tackle that challenge. But give me your take on this.
Okay, so that's a big question, John. But I will go first. And I think, what you said is right, that all these issues are intertwined. It's an integrated food and farming system, right? It's all wrapped up in each other. But since you mentioned that, these days my focus is a lot on new gen producers, and I think I'm a planner by trade. I think a lot about the future and the future of agriculture. I think that when you look at that new generation, you see a lot of people where these issues are actually intertwined just in the way they're approaching things. So they're coming in because they care about community. They're coming in because they recognize climate change and want to do something to address climate change. A lot of them are focused on local and regional food systems. A lot of them are practicing organic or regenerative practices. Most of them are small, struggling with these viability issues, trying to give back to their communities while also being able to either have long-term secure leases or even be able to purchase land, and then they want to raise families and send their kids to college, and it all gets wrapped up in a bundle. On the other hand, I think that you see a lot of connections to farmland protection. So that's sort of where we started. And if we don't protect the land, it's not going to be available in the future. You mentioned a lot of ways to do that. I think one place where I've seen a lot of opportunities occur over, certainly the last generation is through these public ag conservation easement programs or using conservation easements to permanently protect land. Because that helps not only keep it available, but it also actually helps keep it more affordable.
Right, exactly.
And that's really, really important because it's permanently protecting a supply of land for the future.
Yeah.
And now some of those programs, some of the older programs that were pioneers, back in the, say, 80s and 90s, creating these programs, are now linking those easement programs with next gen and young and beginning farmers. So I think it's all tied up. I could go on, but I know others need to.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I mean, I've been in this game for a long time, and there's really been a progression, right? Farmland protection was originally done. We got to protect the resource, and then people realized, oh, it's also a way of adding viability to the farm if we're fairly compensating farmers for what they're giving up, and that also means now the farm with an easement on it is more affordable to the next generation. There's been sort of this progression of thinking about the broader circles of benefit, and now we're really thinking about, wow, and that protected land at a more affordable price is the right vehicle for that next generation. In fact, in many places in this country, as you know, it's the only land that beginning farmers can afford. So thanks for that. Jimmy, same question to you. Where do you see some of these connections?
So 3 examples. The first one is if we lose the land, we lose the opportunity to restore and use the restorative benefits of it. But an example of that also is how we lose the land makes a difference, because if we lose it to sprawling development, we've done research that shows that if we're losing the land to sprawling development, we're actually going to have increased greenhouse gas emissions in the future. So that's just a link between the land and this idea of what we were just talked about in terms of the practices being a way to reduce greenhouse gases. Number 2 is this really is a social behavioral question. Right? You talked about practices, but practices don't happen. They only happen through people. So this is a change in behavior question, right? We talked about adoption questions and barriers to adoption. So it's all about the people, really, right? The practices come if we can engage, and the farmers and ranchers can see that this makes sense for their operations. And then just lastly, and I think Julia touched on it, is the whole question of the people and farmer, rancher, landowner makes a difference, because ownership affects how you think about practices, how you think about investments, and how you think about what you do on the land. So it's totally interconnected. If we were going to try to accelerate adoption of conservation practices in the Midwest, and some of the counties in Illinois have over 80% rented land, it's just a different situation.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Mitch, I'm going to turn to you. You're here talking about the land, but your role at AFT is really about research. And, my I'm an engineer, not a scientist, and so but that means that I have some of the guilt here too. Science and engineering seem to get focused narrower and narrower on things rather than necessarily looking at the system. Your response to this question, wearing a research hat, how are there opportunities? Is there value of looking at this more holistically? And what are some examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's partly why I didn't just study agronomy. I also studied ecology, right? So I could think about the whole system and how all the pieces fit together. And so I'm thinking right now about the link between the land and the practices. And a lot of the times we're obviously out there always arguing we need to save the land. But there's a lot of people from an academic standpoint who have done analyses of how much land do we need. And that just always raises the question for me, for what? How much land do we need for what? Right. Well, if we're talking about the next 10, 15 years of a climate that's mostly what we know, and we're not thinking beyond that, and we can just max out production in the short term, sure, we have enough land to feed people for the next 10 or 15 years. But if we think long-term, big picture about the whole system and how much land do we need, not just to do maximum productivity production practices for 10 or 15 years, but that's going to be there to grow us food in 50 and 100 years when there's a lot more people on the planet. And also that's going to be managed in a way that the whole system fits together so that we don't keep people fed in 50 or 100 years, but they've got nowhere to go swimming and nowhere to go fishing. And the rest of their life is lesser because of the way that we've managed the land. We've let the soils erode and we've let the waterways get dirty, and we have a climate that is nothing like any of us today, have ever experienced. So really for me, I think there's a really interesting research question that I hope to be digging deeper and deeper into, of how do we link that up? Not just how much land do we need, but if we use all the best practices across the landscape, use each piece of land for its best use in a holistic sense, which can include ecological uses. It can include types of farming. It must include types of farming where the ecological outcomes are really integrated into how it's managed. Then how much land do we need, and how do we get to that kind of optimized outcome that gives us not just food production for the next 10 or 15 years, but prosperity deep into the future.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of amazing if you think about it. I mean, food and environment are, you would say, two of the most fundamental things we need, right? We need to eat and we need to live somewhere. So we need a hospitable planet and we need nourishment. And there has been, some studies, some really good studies about how much food we're going to need in the future and where it's going to come from. But there's really been nothing that links food production in an integrated, holistic way to all the myriad of other services that farmland also provides. And so this is an area, not just to toot AFT's horn for a moment. I mean, this is an area where we have been connecting the dots for years, and we're really poised for this next wave of research, which sounds like something someone should have studied a heck of a long time ago, but they haven't. And part of it is it's complicated. It's more complicated than it sounds. But we're getting into that space, and that's part of the reason why Mitch is heading up our research team, because it's something he's passionate about. I want to turn to a couple of questions. People have been sending in questions, which is great to see. So I have to see if I can figure out how to use this technology, because I'm now down lower in the queue. I want to be fair to the people who are up closer to the top. So let me scroll here, see what I can find. Okay, here's someone. And this might be one for you, Jimmy, given your background in the space. What sort of legislation, if that is what's needed, would enable farmers to afford the risk of taking on better environmental practices?
So great question. This is something that has occupied us and a lot of others working in this field for a while. I think that there's a really good basis for these policies, right? We have the federal Farm Bill, which, as John said, has the conservation title, and there's a lot of really good programs there. And there's more than one program, right, to try to address a number of these different issues. What we're finding is that there also are a lot of state programs, and there's a lot of state leadership on this, especially in the area of soil health and carbon farming. But the kinds of things are increased cost share, to share the cost of, as I said, some of these things of taking on the cost of implementing a conservation program, funding technical assistance. Many farmers do this on their own or don't see a big cost, want to do it for increasing soil health, but they need the technical assistance. They are full-time, 101% farming, and so they need much more technical assistance, and it's always one of those things that gets cut out of budgets. There's need for new equipment. There's, so there's financial questions. There are also some things that are on the horizon, and we still need to do some more work, but the better we get at quantifying those conservation outcomes, then we might be able to pay based on those. And those are things that we would want to have, like sequestering carbon or reducing nitrogen. And if we can quantify that and pay that, you get something that looks like an environmental market. And farmers are really into markets. They would love to play in that. And so that's another one that is a little more forward looking, but that's an example of some of the innovations on the horizon.
Great, thanks. I am going to apologize to the person who asked that question, because this format being new to me, I didn't realize his name would appear here, and he may not be comfortable with that. So unless Alex can do some magic so in the future names don't appear, let's not put the comment up on the screen, and I'll just read it. So, but I've got one here. Someone is asking, can you talk about the difference of cost of community services between developed land and farmland or ranch land? Probably Julia, having been a veteran of many cost of community service studies, you're the best one to answer that.
Sure. So yeah, that was the question that we were asking a lot in the 1990s when we were trying to make a fiscal argument, especially for tax policies, but also for protecting farmland. And now there have been, I don't know, 150, 200 of these studies done all across the country, and they all come out the same, which is that farmland, farm, forest, open lands require much less back in public services, police, fire, roads, blah, 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 especially than residential land use. So that doesn't mean don't build houses. It just means understand that agriculture is a commercial land use. We should look at it as a commercial land use. And that helps then balance out a community's budget. So let's not just willy-nilly develop the land. Let's recognize it as economic and fiscal benefit to balance things out, not to replace housing or good schools in our communities.
And the bottom line, I mean, the AFT did 70 or so of these studies, and almost uniformly, regardless of state, regardless of community, they show almost the same thing, which is that farmland and ranch land pay more in taxes, often even under current use programs, than services. So if you're thinking of it purely from a municipal cost point of view, that's what you want. That's a form of economic development that pays for itself and then some. Whereas other forms of what you think growth is good, but growth comes with costs, sometimes significant costs. Another question here. I've read that overproduction is a major problem. Can you speak to that? And if it is a basic problem, then does bringing in new farmers, that doesn't seem like the right answer. So a couple issues here. What's really going on with our farm system? And if we have enough production already, do we need new farmers? Anyone want to tackle one or both parts of that?
I think the second part is clearly for Julia, but I can try to jump in on the first part. Okay. It's such an interesting comment, and a good comment. You know, when I worked at AFT in the past, in 2010 to 2012, prices were skyrocketing, and the only thing people were talking about was how we were all going to starve, and we needed more land and double food production, and it was kind of a Malthusian sky is falling thing where we were going to run out of the ability to feed ourselves. And at the time, there was a food shortage globally, and that made sense. And so we changed our farm policy pretty drastically, took acres away from conservation programs and dollars away from conservation programs so that people could farm more of their acres. And then and it was, at the time, it was hilarious. Everybody called it the new normal. Corn prices are going to be high, supply is going to be limited. And then, of course, 2 years later, the new normal disappeared, and we've been in a very long period of low prices and high production. And I think what this shows to me is that there's a real mismatch between, how the system is set up for the big players versus the farmers. If you're a farmer in this system, all you can do is either try to produce a lot more or make your margins really, really small. And both of those kind of cut against the basic premises of doing good conservation. Not that there aren't great big farms that do great conservation. There are, but for the most part, the farmer's incentive is to greatly reduce their margin and just have scale to be able to make it. And so that just pushes further and further into this realm of overproduction. So it just shows how out of whack the incentives are. And if we were focused on balance of production, yes, feeding ourselves, markets, having the income from that, but also conservation at the same time, and not just production at all costs, I think the farmers certainly and the land would all come out better off.
Great.
So
we're gonna stop you there, and I'm not going to give Julia a chance to answer the second part of the question because there's one final thing we want to do now, and we only have a couple minutes left. But I'll answer the question by just saying yes. Farmers are important, critically important, and we can't do what we need to do without them. But what I want to do in the final 4 minutes here is get a taste on, we've been talking about challenges. We're going to have a program with the same three of you in 2 days on Tuesday. We're going to have another program of talking about what's happening and what else needs to happen to confront these challenges. So I just want to go through the three of you briefly, give us a little taste, a little preview of something exciting that's out there that's happening to confront these challenges. Let's start with you, Julia.
Okay, so on Tuesday, I'll talk a lot about the work we're doing. We're doing a lot of work to try to build infrastructure, to create networks of people to support beginning farmers, new gen producers, gaining access to land and so on. But I think that what we've been talking about today really are systems issues. And so for systems issues, we need systems solutions. And one of the ways to get there is through policy. And I do think that there are a lot of policy opportunities available to us. And so I would say going forward, I'm just thinking now, some of what Mitch was talking about, Jimmy was talking about, and I could talk about too, is smart growth policies. Smart growth policies are ways to reduce, make more compact communities, reduce the use of fossil fuel. It also is a way to protect farmland. And when you look at some of the economic development work going on in smart growth these days, then you also see ways to open up new opportunities for local and regional food systems and for new gen producers and small and mid-sized. So I think that there are a lot of policy solutions that we could.
Super, good. Jimmy, briefly.
Yes, give you one example. Recently, the states have taken a leadership role in this area of climate smart agriculture. And as I said, some of the states have much higher adoption rates, and they have new programs and pilot programs that are actually increasing adoption and lowering the cost sort of per acre. So one of the things that AFD and its partners are doing is working to share and to advance those effective and innovative state policies with U.S. Climate Alliance states across the country. There are 25 states working on this to help them build better, stronger state climate policy. So we can talk, that's just an example of one of the things that we're doing, but we can talk more about research and policy advocacy and training and other programs that are going, and even talk about smart solar siting. But what we're looking toward is a future where U.S. agriculture would be climate neutral.
Great. I know that's our goal. We've set it as one of our goals, but we're going to talk about that on Tuesday. Mitch, your take on that.
Well, I mean, as a professional nerd, I will look to the data always. And We already have the data on what states can do as far as what Julia was talking about with smart growth and better farmland protection, helping bring farmers into the field. We are, in terms of the big we, with colleagues, are working towards understanding what states are also doing to do what Jimmy was talking about, not just U.S. Climate Alliance, all the states, how they're going to help farmers implement these good practices. And then we're also looking ahead to 2040, so we can understand exactly where the threats are going to be, what they look like, so that we can make smart decisions and ultimately put that data out there and empower people and communities to get together and make these far-sighted decisions together. So they're looking to the future and what they want their community to be like, and they've got all the resources there to make a good decision.
Great, great. Well, I can't thank the three of you enough, and we're all going to be back together on Tuesday. The format on Tuesday is different. It's actually like a phone-in call. It's one of our free-range conversations. Some of you in the audience may have been part of those before. It's more about questions and answers, and we didn't get to as many Q&A as I would have liked, but I have them listed, so we're going to incorporate some of those into our conversation on Tuesday. And as I said, it's also a great platform for you to ask questions. We should be able to get to more answers on Tuesday. Farming, I said at the beginning that farming is our future. That's how we view it here at AFT. I hope you share that view. And we'll tune in on Tuesday to find out what we need to do to make sure we have the kind of future we want to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Long, everyone. Thanks, Alex. Good job.